All right, let's dive into this whole space junk situation. It's way more than just a bunch of clutter up there, you know. I mean, we're talking potential financial chaos for the space industry. And, what hits the space industry eventually hits our wallets too. I've got some really interesting articles here from Newsweek, CNN, and even a report from the ESA, the European Space Agency. And, well, let's just say the picture isn't pretty. But luckily, I've got an expert here with us today who can help us make sense of it all. They can see the financial shrapnel flying before it even hits, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, it's a rapidly growing industry, space, but this junk situation, it's putting some serious financial pressure on everything. It's not
Yeah.
just about like some catastrophic event happening, although that's definitely a worry.
Right, because, I mean,
Mm.
launching anything into space these days, it's like you're playing this ridiculously expensive game of celestial dodgeball. And, that ESA report you sent over, it really paints a stark picture,
It
doesn't it?
does.
Over 9,300 tons of debris circling Earth. That's like, what, 8 Eiffel Towers worth of junk up there?
Yeah, it's mind-boggling when you think about it like that. And we're not even talking about just big, like, metal structures up there. It's everything, really. Defunct satellites, spent rocket stages, even tiny things like paint flecks.
Paintplex,
Yeah,
seriously.
yeah. And each piece, no matter how small, it's basically a bullet whizzing around at insane speeds.
And even something as tiny as a paint fleck could cause serious damage at those speeds.
Absolutely. Imagine a paint chip, right? But it's slamming into a satellite at like thousands of kilometers per hour. The
Yeah.
damage could be catastrophic. You could lose crucial communication systems, navigation systems. The whole thing could be toast.
So launching a satellite, I mean, it just got a whole lot riskier, and I bet a lot more expensive too. But, I mean, where's all this junk coming from in the first place? Not like we're throwing our old toasters up there, are we?
Well, some of it is accidental, like explosions that happen during launches or while satellites are in orbit. They can create a whole shower of debris.
Makes sense.
But then there's the stuff that comes from deliberate actions, which is kind of wild.
Deliberate. What do you mean?
Like missile tests.
Missile tests.
Yeah, back in 2007, China conducted this anti-satellite test.
Right. I remember hearing about that.
And that single event, it increased the amount of trackable debris in orbit by 25%.
25%.
Yeah.
That's insane. And I guess this brings us to that term we hear all the time, Kessler Syndrome. Can you break that down for us? What exactly is it, and how does it play into the whole financial side of things?
Okay, so Kessler Syndrome. It's basically the nightmare scenario for the space industry.
Okay, I'm all ears.
It's this chain reaction where one collision in space creates a cascade of more and more debris, and eventually it could get so bad that low Earth orbit becomes completely unusable. We're talking unusable for generations, potentially.
So it's like one fender bender leads to a cosmic pileup.
Exactly. And from a financial perspective, it would be a complete and utter disaster.
I can imagine.
Imagine a world where suddenly all our satellite services are unreliable.
Or completely gone.
Gone, yeah. No more reliable GPS, weather forecasting goes out the window.
No satellite internet.
Right. Even things like financial transactions, they all rely on satellites to some extent.
Wow. Okay, that is a chilling thought. I mean, we're talking about disrupting global communications, navigation,
Yeah.
even financial markets.
Yeah.
This is starting to feel less like a science fiction problem and more like,
Mm-hmm.
a real threat to the global economy.
It is a real threat. And, as the space industry keeps growing, the financial stakes just keep getting higher. Companies are investing billions in these huge satellite constellations for internet access, Earth observation, all sorts of things. But if Kessler Syndrome starts to unfold, all those investments could vanish in a cloud of space junk.
Oof, gone.
It's like an insurance nightmare waiting to happen.
I can only imagine how much insurance premiums would skyrocket.
Yeah.
If your satellite's constantly at risk of getting pulverized by some random piece of junk.
Oh, yeah. The insurance side of things is already getting messy.
Yeah.
The risk of collisions is definitely driving up costs for everyone. And, if those costs become too high, it could really stifle innovation and slow down the entire industry.
So it's not just about the cost of cleaning up the mess afterwards. It's about the cost of doing business in space. It's getting riskier and riskier, more expensive.
Right.
This is really highlighting how space junk isn't just an environmental problem. It's a financial problem with huge consequences.
Exactly. And for companies like SpaceX with their Starlink project, they're planning to launch thousands of satellites for internet service, right? but the risk is multiplied for them. I mean, imagine the financial fallout if even a small percentage of those satellites were taken out by debris.
It's like they're betting the farm on this.
Yeah.
And speaking of SpaceX, they're often mentioned in these discussions about space junk. Newsweek mentioned they've launched nearly 7,000 Starlink satellites already. That's a lot of potential debris up there. Are their efforts to mitigate the risks really enough, though?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's
Well,
something we'll definitely dig into more deeply later on. But the point is, there's this tension between ambition and responsibility. Companies like SpaceX are pushing the boundaries, doing incredible things, but they're also adding to this problem, and that creates a financial risk for everyone, not just them.
it's a balancing act for sure. Pushing innovation, but also trying to prevent a financial meltdown in space.
Exactly. And this brings up another interesting point. What happens when good intentions meet the bottom line? What are the financial pressures driving these companies' decisions? And how does that impact their approach to space debris mitigation?
That's a great point. So we've established that space junk is more than just an eyesore. It's a growing financial threat to the entire space industry. But what can we actually do about it? Are there any realistic solutions out there that can address both the environmental and the economic concerns?
There are some glimmers of hope out there. Some companies are working on some really innovative solutions, like developing technologies to capture and remove debris, or designing satellites that naturally deorbit at the end of their life.
Oh, it's interesting.
And there's a growing push for international regulations to promote responsible behavior in space.
So it sounds like we're at a crossroads here.
We are.
We can either continue down this path where space just becomes riskier and riskier, more expensive, more dangerous, or we can invest in solutions that protect the environment and the future of the space industry.
Exactly. The decisions we make now will have consequences for a long time, and not just for businesses and investors, but for anyone who relies on the benefits of space technology.
For listeners, buckle up, because we're about to dive even deeper into those potential solutions. We'll explore the financial and technological innovations that could help us navigate this increasingly crowded and dangerous orbital landscape. Stay tuned for part 2.
Okay, so we've got this potential financial black hole up in orbit, but is anyone actually trying to turn space junk into, space cash?
That's a great question. I mean, it seems a bit counterintuitive, doesn't it? Like trying to make money off cleaning up a landfill. But I guess where there's a problem, there's usually someone trying to find a solution, right? And hopefully a profit too.
Exactly. And there are some pretty interesting approaches starting to pop up. Some companies are focusing on what they call active debris removal, which is basically developing technology to capture large pieces of space junk and bring them down.
So like cosmic garbage trucks.
Kinda, yeah. Think robotic spacecraft, equipped with things like harpoons, nets, even lasers, all designed to snag those massive chunks of debris and then drag them back into Earth's atmosphere to burn up.
Whoa, that sounds like something straight out of a sci-fi movie.
Yeah.
But are these space garbage collectors actually feasible, in the real world? And who's going to pay for all this?
It's definitely not cheap, that's for sure. But the potential return on investment is huge. Remember those sky-high insurance premiums we were talking about?
Oh, okay.
If companies can effectively remove the highest risk debris, those premiums could go way down. And suddenly, space becomes a much more attractive place to do business.
It's like investing in a better highway system, but for space.
That's a great analogy. And actually, some governments are starting to offer incentives to companies working on debris removal. They're starting to recognize those long-term economic benefits of a cleaner space environment.
Interesting. So there's a financial case to be made for tackling this problem. But what about preventing it in the first place? Is anyone focusing on stopping this junk from piling up in orbit to begin with?
Absolutely. There's a growing movement towards something called design for demise.
Design for demise.
Yeah, it's essentially designing satellites that are programmed to safely deorbit themselves at the end of their lives.
So you're building in a self-destruct sequence, but one that sends the satellite back to Earth instead of blowing it up into a million pieces.
Exactly. Think of it like a retirement plan for satellites. Instead of just hanging out in orbit for decades, posing a collision risk, they gracefully re-enter the atmosphere and burn up.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. But let's be realistic here. Not every company is going to prioritize space sustainability over profits, right? How do we ensure everyone plays by the rules?
Yeah.
That no one just sees space as this giant free dumping ground?
That's where regulations and international cooperation come in. The UN has been working on guidelines for responsible behavior in space, and several countries are implementing their own regulations to minimize debris creation.
So it's like creating traffic laws, but for space.
Exactly. And these regulations can have a real impact on the bottom line. For example, the FCC in the US recently adopted a new rule requiring satellites to deorbit within 5 years of completing their mission.
5 years. That's a big change from the old 25-year rule.
It is, and this shorter time frame puts pressure on companies to design for demise, which ultimately helps protect the space environment and reduces the risk of collisions, which, as we've talked about, has a huge financial upside.
So it seems like there's a shift happening, at least in some parts of the industry. But are these voluntary efforts enough? Or do we need stricter regulations, with real consequences for breaking the rules?
That's the debate right now. Some people think self-regulation and market forces will be enough, that companies will do the right thing out of self-interest. Others think we need stronger international laws with teeth.
It's a tough question. Balancing innovation with responsibility is never easy, especially when there's so much money at stake.
And that's what makes this so interesting. How do we incentivize companies to do the right thing for the long-term health of space, but also allow them to stay competitive and profitable?
It's a challenge, but it's one we need to figure out. We want to ensure a sustainable future for the space industry.
And the financial health of everyone involved?
It's all connected. We started talking about cleaning up the mess, preventing future debris. But is there actually a way to turn space junk into a resource?
Now, that's a fascinating idea. It's like the ultimate recycling project. There are some early-stage companies out there exploring the possibility of mining space debris for valuable materials.
Wait, so you're talking about taking these defunct satellites, rocket parts, and turning them into something useful?
Exactly. It's a long shot, but if it works, it could completely change how we think about space junk. It wouldn't be a problem anymore. It would be a potential resource.
That would be incredible. Not only would it incentivize debris removal, but it could also mean we'd need to mine less from Earth, which is good for the environment.
It's a win-win situation, at least in theory. It's still very early days for space debris mining, though. There are a lot of technological and legal hurdles to overcome.
I can imagine. But it's exciting to think about, turning this cosmic junkyard into a valuable asset.
And a source of profit.
It's amazing how interconnected this all is. We started by talking about paint flecks, and now we're talking about mining asteroids. It really shows how space junk isn't just an environmental issue. It's a financial, technological, and even ethical challenge. And we need to face it head on.
It's also a reminder that the decisions we make now have ripple effects for years, decades to come, the future of the space industry, and maybe even humanity's future beyond Earth. It all hinges on finding sustainable solutions to this growing problem.
Well, listeners, we've covered a lot of ground in part 2, from cosmic garbage collectors to the potential of space mining. But we're not done yet. In part 3, we'll delve into the legal and ethical complexities of space junk, explore who's ultimately responsible for cleaning up this mess, and discuss the potential consequences of doing nothing. So stay tuned for the final part of our deep dive, where we'll try to answer the question, what does the future hold for space, and how will it all impact us here on Earth? All right, welcome back to our deep dive on space junk. We talked about the financial risks, the potential for things to go really wrong, and even some of the hopeful solutions out there, new technologies, regulations. But there's this whole other side to this we haven't really touched on yet, the legal and ethical stuff. I mean, it's great to talk about cleaning up space, but who's actually responsible for doing it? And what happens when a piece of space junk, causes damage?
Yeah, that's where things get a little tricky. The current international laws when it comes to space junk, they're pretty vague, to be honest.
So, like, if a piece of some old defunct satellite from, say, Russia crashes into a brand new space telescope from, I don't know, China, who pays for that?
That's the million-dollar question, literally, and there's no easy answer. The Outer Space Treaty from back in 1967, it's kind of like the rule book for space, right?
Right.
It says that countries are liable for damage caused by their space objects, but it doesn't really get into the nitty-gritty of space debris.
So it seems like that could lead to some diplomatic headaches.
Oh, absolutely.
Legal battles, especially with more and more countries and private companies launching things into space.
It's a recipe for disaster, potentially. This lack of clarity, it creates this huge